this segment, guys. So today I'm here with Mr. Eriki. Just like a fish out of water in this area, it's about science, it's about rocket science, it's about fusion, it's a whole lot of other issues. And the question is, why is it delving into this realm? Why is it important to talk about science and technology? Well, if you look at politics in the world today, there's no way you can talk about anything without science and without technology. Even wars are fought on the back of technology. What gives you advantage and superiority is technology. So it's a very interesting conversation today I want to have with Mr. Eriki, and I have a host of questions that I intend to ask him. Welcome to the segment, Mr. Eriki.
Thank you, Sal.
All right, so let's start with, recently we saw the attack on the US attack on Iran, on their nuclear facilities in Iran. And the fact that the Israelis were able to shoot down most of the air defense system, that the Iranians have. So it was fascinating for me to try and understand, how rocket science works, how this technology works. So I'll start by asking you this simple question. Now there are multi-stage rockets, what is rocket science basically?
Rocket science is basically an aspect of science that deals with space travel, and all it needs or it requires is we have a space craft or a vehicle that travels to the space, either for exploration or for a particular purpose, which could be launching of satellites. But rocket science is all about space traveling.
Yeah, so can you tell us more about the design? How is this thing, how is it done? What are the layers to it? This is an area that is very important in order to understand how technology works and to fuse that in with politics.
A rocket generally is a space craft, and it has the first layer, which we call the nose, and we have the other layers. We have the fins, and we have the propellants, and then we have the engine in the rocket. The design of a rocket depends on, one, the purpose with which that rocket is to function. There are some designs that have a single stage, others have multiple stage. For instance, if you have a single stock rocket, and that stock contains the engine and the propellant, and the fuel, that is the propellant, is responsible for the entire journey of the rocket. That is a single start rocket or single stage rocket. But today we have multiple stage rockets. These multiple stage rockets, you have two or more rocket stocks in stages, either arranged in series or arranged in parallel, and in some other conditions you have a combination of series and parallel arrangement. And each stage, the interesting part of it, that each stage carries its own engine and the propellant. Such arrangement is what we call a multi-stage rockets.
Yeah. So speaking of single-stage rockets and multi-stage rockets, what is the major difference? And the reason I'm asking is in terms of payload. Is it better when it is multi-stage rockets, in terms of the ability to carry more payload, or is it more with single-stage rockets?
When we talk of payload is the desired load, either to be launched in space or the apartment of the rocket that carries the personality that wants to go for space exploration. And the payload is attached to the first layer, which is the nose of the first layer of the rocket. Now, with respect to payload, if for a single stage rocket, the payload is the entire space is responsible for the thrust of the payload, and the higher the weight of the rocket, the lower the payload. But the multiple stage rocket is designed in such a way that as one as the fuel of one apartment or one stack is used up, automatically that stock is jettisoned. And once it is jettisoned, it reduces the overall weight, and it continues like that. So, which means the weight reduces with altitude, or we got to the final stage. And the advantage of this is that the reduction of the weight increases the thrust, that is the speed of the rocket, and as well reduces the weight and paving way for more payloads to be carried. So that is why the multi-stage rockets are better to carry a higher payload than the single-stage rockets.
Yeah, speaking of thrust, can you explain the concept of thrust to weight ratio?
Yes, when we talk of thrust to weight ratio, generally there are a lot of forces acting on the rocket. One of them is the forward thrust. Another is the what? The weight. And these two forces work in opposite direction. The higher the weight, the lower the thrust. But rockets are designed in such a way that even the material, the structural materials, the weight of the structural material have to be considered, because we need materials of lower weight. Because the higher the thrust to weight ratio, the greater the acceleration and the speed, and that reduces the time taken for the rocket to get to the desired orbit. So, in the construction of rockets, for a rocket to function properly or to have the required thrust, the thrust to weight ratio must be greater than 1. Anything less than 1, the rocket will not take off. It will not lift up. So the lifting thrust, for lifting to take place, then the thrust to weight ratio must be greater than 1. And this goes to the body material. So when we now talk of the multi-stage rockets, the multi-stage rocket, which is designed in layers, as the layers are reducing, the thrust to weight ratio is increasing, the acceleration is increasing, the time to taking, the velocity is increasing, and the time taking to get to the velocity, which we call the escape velocity, where the acceleration into gravity of the planet will be overcome, will be lower. So, and once that is overcome, then the rocket can continue its motion without any force, any retarding force that is bringing it back to the Earth.
Yeah, so basically you're saying the better the thrust to weight ratio, it increases the chance of the range. Is that a completely different aspect?
Increasing the chance of the range, yes. The higher the thrust to weight ratio, the higher the altitude the rocket will be able to attain, the faster it travels, and the lower the time taken to beat the acceleration into gravity. That is the gravitational force of pull of the Earth.
Yeah. So that brings me to my next point, which is about aerodynamics. So what is the importance of aerodynamics in terms of the rocket's atmospheric ascent in phase?
Yes, when it comes to aerodynamics, we are actually talking about the flow of air through the rockets. And in space travel, the air resistance is one of the negating factors that any engineer looks into when we are constructing, even down to our vehicle that plies the road. The vehicles are constructed in such a way that there is a minimum air resistance. So how is the ease with which the atmospheric air flows through the rockets? That is what aerodynamics is all about. And this has to be taken into consideration from the construction. One, the nose part of the rocket has to be, is it pointed, is it circular? All these affect the what? Aerodynamics. So, and the stability of the rocket, the fins of the rocket maintain stability to ensure it's also there because such that as the rocket thrusts, the fins of the rocket experience some drag force.
Yeah.
And this drag force is also important because it maintains its stability and ensures that the rocket is still is in upright direction. Else, it continues to wobble. So, which means there is an appropriate optimization between the drag of the fins and the thrust of the air. all these create balancing. So aerodynamics is an aspect that deals with how the air flows through the rocket and ensure that the rocket maintains stability without wobbling.
Yeah, another important aspect is heat. Because in designing some of these spacecraft and in designing some of these rockets, you also have to put that into consideration. So the question is, how do engineers protect rockets and spacecraft from the intense heat of atmospheric re-entry?
Yes, in space travel or in space journey, during re-entry is that point where the astronaut enters back into the atmospheric layer of the planet or the air. At that point, there is a critical friction, and there could be a drastic temperature change. In some instances, the temperature could be very, very high, and because that high temperature is a result of the friction between the air and also the radiation generated within that particular orbit. Now, how can we reduce this high temperature change? Because in the design of rockets, for space travel, there are very wide range of temperature changes. Because in the space, there are some regions where the temperature will be very low, while other regions, the temperature becomes very high. This brings us to the choice of material selection. In engineering, material selection is a key. So if the same goes to the construction of rockets, the materials have to be selected. This material, we must use materials that can withstand the both temperature. So there are materials that can go down to the cryogenic level and as well maintain structural stability even at very, very high temperature. Then we have what we call the thermal protection system materials. Thermal protection system materials today are being used, and modern thermal protection system materials are being discovered. These are materials such that once a rocket is designed, the nose part of the rocket is cladded with these thermal protection materials. These materials can withstand very high temperature, they can withstand thermal shock, they can withstand even low temperature. They are cladded with these materials, and with this, the temperature changes can be resisted. And also, some examples of these materials, we have the silica cladding materials. The silica cladding materials, we also have the carbon reinforced composite material. Composite materials, these are materials produced as a result of combination of two different materials because we want to harmonize some desired properties. These materials we call them thermal protection materials, which are used in regulating temperature changes, especially during re-entry when we are entering back into the Earth, where there are a lot of friction and temperature changes.
Yeah. And speaking of the choice of materials in the design of some of these spacecraft, whether they are heat resistant, there was this story that was told about Haiti. Again, what I try to do is to integrate this with politics and what is happening around the world, because this is my area. I'm not the best when it comes to nuclear science, rocket science, and so on and so forth. But there was a story that broke out, I think, around 2011 or 2012, that the U.S. have been in Haiti for a very long time, and that they were getting and digging up, the raw materials for iridium, which is, they said, is heat resistant and is used for building some of these spacecraft that you talked about. Yeah, so you're saying that the choice of material is very important, and the design is very important. And one more thing I also want to add as part of this, maybe you can elaborate and educate us more. The base of this is the rocket science and the design, and this rocket science and technology, which you said is meant for space journey and so on and so forth. But the same technology is now applied to warfare. The same technology is now applied to building, rockets and delivery systems that will carry a payload with explosives on it, in order to hit target, as we've seen recently. Do you have anything to educate us on that aspect in terms of the use of this technology or the use of rocket science in terms of warfare?
Yes, we live in a society or in a world where every country wants to dominate. Every country wants to be a warlord. And for this, of course, it is natural, because even in the animal kingdom, that tendency for dominance is always there. And for this, that is why, yes, rocket science today, in as much as rockets are used in space journey, there are, in fact, today we classify the world into the first class, second class countries. Every country wants to. And what is the criteria for this classification? One of them is how much of the weapons do you have, and how much of the technology do you have. So when we talk of the rocket science, different countries are trying to advance in the technology of space travel, which involves the rocket. Some of them also see rockets as means of launching missiles. They also see rockets as means of spying on other hidden features. So today we talk of satellites. Now, what is satellite all about? Satellite is an object that orbits around a particular planet, for instance, the Earth. And what is the purpose? It's taking surveillance, and some of them are communication satellites, while some are receiving signal. We have different classification of satellites. Some of them are one-way or two-way. So if a country decides to launch satellites, and the satellite oversees everything that is happening within a region, so that could be a spy to other countries, because they are getting information, secret information that naturally they ought not to have gotten. And the excess of this is we want to be in charge. And that is why today this rocket, the space travel, has been converted into the aspect of dominance and technology, so that warfare, each country today is boasting of what weapons, the nuclear weapons I have, and how to launch them. The launching of this weapon goes a long way to the extent of what is the level of space technology that you have.
Yeah, so basically, what you've been able to do is to integrate this aspect of the technology and the science itself with the use in modern day, using this technology to the advantage of the superpowers, so to speak, to maintain hegemony, either regional hegemony or international hegemony. For instance, we talked about the satellites, for surveillance, they get for imagery, they use it for communications basically, and with that, they use it for subversive activities. I'll give you one quick story in that regard. I think it was in 1993. It's popularly known in China as the Yinhe incident. So Yinhe is a Chinese vessel that was carrying goods, and I think headed for the Middle East. So what America did at that time, this was under the leadership of the US President Bill Clinton, was that they switched off the satellites, because the GPS system we use today, the global positioning system, is owned by the United States. It's controlled by American military. In fact, the US military controls the global positioning system that most countries around the world today use for navigation, use for communication, and so on and so forth. So everything you say or do, is sending and receiving signal, all of it, from one medium or source, if you like. So in 1993, what they did was that they said they suspected that vessel, the Chinese vessel called the Yinhe vessel, was carrying chemical materials bound for Iran, and that Iran was going to use it for weapons and stockpiles and so on. So the U.S. Navy forced the Yinhe, to abandon, its route, and left them stranded on the sea by switching off the GPS system, a signal to them, and left it stranded for 23 days. And also forced other countries in the region not to allow them to dock. Why was America able to do this? Just because of some of the things you mentioned, the technological advantage. I mean, China now have their own satellite system, which they call the Baidu system, which is an alternative to the GPS that some countries around the world are using. If you follow the current war between Iran and Israel, Iran was using the GPS system, but they have decided now to switch over to Baidu, because the Israelis, although in designing some of these rockets or some of these missiles, some of them have inbuilt GPS or some sort of satellite system in it. Yeah, but for other purposes as well, you see electronic warfare and the aspect of jamming, which have become, dominant in modern warfare. So the reason I gave you the background is exactly what you said, that people are trying to gain technological advantage over another in order to maintain political hegemony and superiority. No, but having talked of that, let's talk about nuclear science and technology, which is again another aspect that I'm like a fish out of water in terms of nuclear science and weapons development. Let's start with radioactivity. What is radioactivity and how? Let's start with radioactivity. What is radioactivity?
Yeah, when we talk of radioactivity, generally in the periodic table of elements, some elements are naturally stable in the nucleus, while others are naturally unstable. The elements that are naturally unstable will continue to emit radiation spontaneously until a stability is reached. That emission of radiation spontaneously from an unstable nuclide is what we call radioactivity.
And what's the difference between that and fusion, which is another aspect of...
Yeah. When we talk of radioactivity, there are two broad categories of radioactive energy, because generally in the process of emission of radiation, huge amount of energy is released. And it could be in two ways. The nuclear energy could be in two ways. Either through fission, that is splitting of a heavy nuclide into two or more nuclides, or fusion, that is combination of two or more lighter nuclides to form a heavy nuclide. In both cases, huge amount of energy is released.
Yeah, and speaking of that, let's talk about isotopes like uranium-235 and uranium-238 and how they define behavior.
Yes, in the concept of radioactivity, let us not forget that radioactivity was first discovered by Henry Becquerel. And he discovered it from uranium. Uranium, it has two isotopes. When we talk of isotopes, these are atoms, two or more atoms, having the same atomic number but different atomic masses. Uranium, we have uranium-238 and uranium-235. Uranium-238 naturally is the natural uranium. Like when we have the uranium in the earth crust, 99.7% of the uranium is uranium-238. Just a small fraction of it, about 0.7%, is 235. But the uranium-238 is not a naturally fish-stable element. That is, it does not undergo nuclear fission naturally on its own. But uranium-235 is a naturally fissile what? Element. And what the difference between the two is in their number of neutrons. Yes, such that while the uranium-235 has 143 neutrons, uranium-238 has 146 neutrons, a difference of 3 neutrons. So with that introduced a mass difference between the two isotopes. So that uranium-238 is a heavier isotope than the uranium-235. In addition to the 235 being fissionable, while the other one is not what? Fissionable. That is 238. These are some of the differences.
Yeah, having said that, you said you're trying to give us the difference in terms of behavior between the U-235 and U-238. But having said that, my next question is, how does uranium enrichment work, and why is uranium-235 specifically important for both civilian nuclear energy and military applications?
Yes. When we talk of uranium enrichment, we have just said in a few minutes that a natural existing deposit of uranium contains more percentage of 238 than 235. Yeah. Now, and we have also mentioned that uranium-235 is naturally fissionable, that is, it splits naturally, And the process of splitting, more energy is generated. And sometimes it results into what we call a chain reaction, which will continue and more energy being generated. Now, what is uranium enrichment? It's a process of increasing the concentration of uranium-235 and reducing the concentration of uranium-238 present. Now, that process is what we call enrichment. So, the percentage of enrichment it depends on how much is the concentration. What is the percentage of uranium-235 we now have in the uranium deposits? So, every country is trying to increase the number or the concentration or the percentage of uranium-235 because that is what fission do. So, because more energy is going to be released or absorbed when we have more percentage of uranium-235 than uranium-238, which is not fission. Naturally, uranium-238 is not, we can say it is not naturally radioactive. But it can be activated to become what? Radioactive. And through what means? If it is struck with a fast-moving what? Neutron. Once the 238 is struck with a fast-moving neutron, it will be converted into a new isotope of uranium that we call it uranium-239. This 239 is an unstable nuclide of uranium. And because it's not stable, it will undergo what we call a beta decay. A beta decay means it is releasing electrons. Once it undergoes a beta decay, it will transform into a new nuclide called newtonium. Newtonium will again undergo another beta decay, which will now produce what we call plutonium. Now, plutonium is an element with atomic number of 94. That is two protons higher than uranium. But plutonium is now naturally radioactive, and that is why today plutonium is as well used in generating nuclear energy. Almost the same way the uranium-235 will do. So most countries, instead of going through uranium enrichment, we decide to say, okay, let me convert uranium-238 to what? Plutonium. But the difference is the half-life of uranium-235 and that of what? Plutonium. Plutonium has a lower half-life than uranium-235. Uranium-235 has a half-life of almost about 400,000 years. About 400,000 years. What it means is that for a gram of uranium-235 to undergo decay to have 0.5 grams, it will take 400,000 years. And the advantage of such a very high half-life is that the process of fission continues for years, millions of years, and the fuel will still be there, very rich in concentration. Yeah. While the one for plutonium, the half-life is about 88,000, which is lower. Yes. Approximately 88,000, which is lower. And that is why the uranium-235 is having an advantage over what? The plutonium.
And this is why a lot of countries around the world now are turning to nuclear energy as an alternative source of power, because the hydro, powered, methods or sources of energy, solar energy, all of these are very fragile. They are not, efficient enough. They are not sustainable. And in order to blend in a bit of politics with it, is recently there was a deal that was signed between Egypt and Russia to help them to build their nuclear plant. So you're seeing that increasingly, even countries like Turkey also trying to sign the same deal with Russia. The Iranians have been on this for 20, 25 years. So you see countries are turning to alternative sources of energy, which is more sustainable, which drives the economy. So it makes a lot of sense that the process, the fusion process, is that how we call it?
Fission.
The fusion, it's continuous and it's sustainable. It's very sustainable. So having said that, let's look at another area, which is, you talked about the decay stages. Can you explain what you mean by decay?
Yeah, when we talk of radioactive decay, generally we have just defined radioactivity as spontaneous emission of radiation. And when a nuclide is not stable, the nuclide continues to disintegrate, that is, break up. That disintegration, we call it radioactive decay. And the disintegration continues until a stable nuclide is formed, if eventually a stable nuclide will be formed. Because, and the decay process is such that as the first splitting takes place, neutrons are released. The neutrons that are released will hit the daughter nuclide and dislodge it and makes it unstable. Because it is unstable, it will undergo a splitting again, another decay. More neutrons are released, and the nucleus will hit the daughter nucleus again, and it continues, and this results into what we call a chain reaction. We have a chain reaction, and each of the decay is accompanied with a huge amount of energy. And at the end of the day, by the time we sum up all the energies released, we discover that a nuclear reaction, a single nuclear reaction, could produce millions of tons of energy, which can be converted either for space exploration or for research, or it will as well be converted into what? Warheads. Because that is what most countries today, some countries are even scared. They are trying to monitor the nuclear technology of another country because they don't want another country to go ahead of them. That is what we are facing today.
Yeah, so basically, and again, if you can elaborate more on this, so how does the decay of uranium-238 eventually lead to these fissile isotopes like plutonium-239, like you mentioned earlier? And why is it significant for weapons production? This is part of what you've explained already, if you can a bit summarize it.
Yes, we have mentioned earlier that uranium-238 naturally is not fissionable. But that is where we talk of another radioactive element, which we call the polonium. Polonium is a radioactive element discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie. The difference is that although it has a very low half-life of about 23 days, but it is used as an initiator of neutrons. Why? When we say initiator, it is like it initiates the process of what? Decay or fission process of another element like the uranium-238. Once the polonium releases the neutron, then the neutron released by polonium strikes the nuclide of uranium-238. Then, striking the nuclide of uranium-238 converts the uranium-238 into a new isotope, uranium-239, which becomes unstable. Then, naturally, uranium-239 will undergo what we call a beta decay by releasing beta particles. Then, it will be converted into what we call the neptunium. Neptunium, again, is not stable. We undergo another beta decay. Then, it will now be converted to what? Plutonium, which is 239, which is another very rich fuel, which is naturally radioactive and can be used for weapon production.
Yeah, as we draw to the end of this conversation, we're streaming live, on one space, and I hope a lot of them are probably enjoying this conversation and they want to see more of this. So we'll try as much as possible to get him on again, probably on the other platform where I would be, we can do it visually if you guys like as well. So, but if you have any questions for him in relation to this topic, so what I'm trying to do again is to integrate science and technology with political reality on the international stage, because technology is very important. There's no way you can talk about power and realism today, particularly on the international stage, without understanding what the basis. The economy is very important, but also what you channel that economy that you have, or the advantages you have in your economy, into technological advantage. And this is why countries like Israel, the United States of America, Russia, and the European countries feel that they have some sort of hegemony and political power. And if you want to go into the realm of realism as a theory of international politics and relations, it's about the states being the primary actors, and because of that, they work towards self-interest. So think of the international system as a jungle, like you said. The jungle is about survival of the fittest. And in this case, states are acquiring technology in order to have advantage over other entities. So this is why this topic is very important. So finally, this is where we draw the conversation to an end. What are the major scientific, engineering, and security challenges involved in designing and building functional nuclear warhead?
Yeah, when it comes to engineering design and functional nuclear warhead, one of the basic challenges is anything nuclear. People always have a negative perception of anything nuclear today. So I would say awareness is a problem. A lot of persons are not aware of what we can actually use this nuclear energy. Because today, people have already have a negative perception. So we need to have a better awareness. Let people be aware that as much as there are the negative part of nuclear energy, they will also have a lot of positive things that we can use the nuclear energy to do. Yeah. Another one is the cost. Yes, cost implication is setting up what most of these warhead. It is it could be expensive. That is, but finally, every nuclear fuel, because of the very long half-life, the overall cost will be low. Yes. But the running cost, the initial setup cost will be very high. Because of that, people run away from it. Another very major factor is how do we dispose these nuclear materials? Because of the safety and that is the health hazard issue. People do not know how to actually maintain, how to regulate, and how to dispose the residue because of their radioactive nature. Because if they are not properly taken care of, the health hazard is there. Because high dose of radioactive radiation could result into cancer. It could be cancer of the blood. For instance, there are some of them that are very dangerous, like polonium that we mentioned, that has a very low half-life, emits alpha particles. These are particles that naturally, yes, the skin, hitting the skin, cannot penetrate the skin. But when you take in a high dose of it can go into the bloodstream and alter, even it can result into what you call the blood cancer. Let us not forget that the same polonium actually led to the death of Marie Curie, who discovered that element.
Yeah, which is, you mentioned some of the advantages for research. You talked about the use of this nuclear technology for energy, and other purposes as well. But again, the other aspect you mentioned is the environmental hazard. There's this, because after the French were kicked out of Niger, I think around 2022 or 2023, documentaries started coming out about what the French have done in the northern part of Niger, in the Air Nazawak region. There's a town called Alit, where they say that the French dumped, tons of uranium residue, which some argue will last for 4 million years. If that makes any sense, because we're talking now about the half-life of uranium-235 or about being over 400,000 years. And I'm like, okay, maybe this is why people have their fears and concern about this, radioactive, element, and even the residue. We're talking about the residue from it, which is still highly radioactive in any sense.
Of course, the residue is highly radioactive. The half-life of uranium-238 is about 1.4 billion years. 1.4 billion years. Which means there will be no depletion at all. Yeah. There will be no depletion. Because if you take 1.4 billion for half of it to decay, so it means that whatever you have from the beginning will remain there. Yeah. And the fuel is renewable, is continuing, in fact, is sustained for a very long time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Eriki. Here we draw the end of the conversation, and I hope we can talk to you again about this particular topic, and if there are other things we need to talk about, I will appreciate that. And hopefully we can do this virtually next time because it's easier. But I decided to come here today in order to have this conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I add one concept? Another concept is that we just talked about the multi-stage rockets. And then we have also explained that in multi-stage rockets, each stack rocket that contains its engine and the propellant is, once it's used up, it is jettisoned. Now the question is, when it is jettisoned, where will it go to? If it's at the lower end, it is believed that it's going to be jettisoned when it is still within the atmosphere, that is the planet region. Yeah. Then that can come off and return back to the earth. But what if it's jettisoned at the upper end? There is what we call, because science today, technology today is trying to reduce what we call the space debris. Yeah. Because this space debris is a threat to space exploration. And to avoid this, some of the modern multi-stage rockets are designed in such a way that the stack, one of the stage, is jettisoned, leaving some amount of fuel, a little amount of fuel. And that little fuel that is left, we have to channel it into what we call the graveyard orbit. There's what we call the graveyard orbit. That is the orbit where most of the planets, most of the satellites that are no more functional are directed to that orbit. Because it is designed so that no functional satellite will orbit within that. So every non-functional space tool or space engine is channeled into that orbit. So that is how it is controlled, because the technology is trying as much as possible to reduce the space debris. And that is why they are trying to see how we can make use of this graveyard orbits.
Yeah, so basically it's fascinating. In designing some of these rockets, there's a lot of planning, a lot of work put into it, from how to launch, to the design, to the aerodynamics, to the range. And now you're talking about how to dispose of the debris. It's fascinating. Thank you so much again, Mr. Eriki.
Is that scene the trial? Can we watch it and see?